All right, good. Hello, this is Mr. Clancy, and I want to make this video to really finish up on these notes. We had looked at these notes before, we've done half of it on ecosystems, concepts, and fundamentals. You go to your text. This is in chapter 5 of your text, which is basically the ecosystem chapter, and talking about some concepts and fundamentals and whatnot. You can see some key terms we'll be looking at, the keystone species. We've talked about, just as a review, biotic and abiotic factors, and really the interrelationships between these two. The living things would be biotic. The physical and chemical environment that they're in would be the abiotic. The other thing is a couple things we talked about with the community. The biological component is the community with a different split with on another video when we talk about biodiversity. But basically, one key takeaway from this is that chemicals recycle in an ecosystem. This is real important that we see this. And we've seen a couple of these, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, carbon cycle. Energy does not cycle, but it kind of goes one way through an ecosystem. All right. And then we talked about the food chain. All right, how food chain, you've got primary consumers, which are also called autotrophs or self-feeders. They provide for the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. And so you're familiar with the heterotrophs, cannot synthesize their own food. The primary producers, autotrophs, which can be either photosynthesizers or chemosynthesizers. Remember, there are some organisms that can make their own food basically by splitting chemical molecules apart if they don't have access to sunlight. And then we looked at the first trophic level and so forth. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. And we also looked at 3 ways that this was a handout that we had. This is also an Academy Sensor, so you should be pretty well familiar with this. Where the decomposers, we talked about detritivores, the stuff that they'll break down, the dead animals and stuff, is called detritus. And down at the bottom there you can see there are, this is level 1, trophic level 1, trophic level 2, trophic level 3, level 4, and then level 5 would be the apex predators. And then we looked at this particular thing. We've got producers, primary consumers. This is kind of basically shows some inorganic chemicals cycling. And again, as we talked about, energy is one way through an ecosystem. It starts with the sun, solar powered, if you will, is used in the system, and then the vast majority of the energy is actually dissipated as heat back out of the ecosystem. So you've got producers, which are your photosynthesizers for the most part, the primary consumers, the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers, and so forth. The other concept to remember is a food web. I think we touched on this a little bit in class, so you might be familiar with this. But a food web basically is where you have the tertiary consumer, for example, does not just eat the secondary consumer, but the tertiary consumer could also eat a primary consumer as well. So they have different types of organisms. The tertiary consumer can have more different types of organisms on its menu, if you will. So this is where the web, where who's eating what in basically an ecosystem gets a little more complicated. So in effect, a food web is kind of a straight chain. All right, just right up where, or excuse me, this would be the food chain itself, my bad. Whereas a food web, all right, can get very complicated. And there's a couple of excellent diagrams in the book here. I would highly recommend that you go over these, and we'll try to go over a couple in class as well. But I think you get the main idea. All right. Now, we also talked about biological friction. We looked at the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is basically about the energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but only changed from one form to another. This key term there is usable energy and non-usable energy, but it's still energy in and of itself. The second law of thermodynamics is basically the law of entropy, and there's a number of different ways to look at it. I've always looked at it in terms of to change energy forms, if you will. To change energy, I'll put forms here. All right, costs energy. So every time you make a change from one type of energy to another, if I go from steam to electrical energy, it's going to, at a power plant, it's going to cost me energy to do that. You can see there, they basically call this entropy. Order requires energy, and the second law of thermodynamics, you can see, predicts that the law of disorder in the universe is increasing. All right, now what I would like to talk with you about is something having to do with energy, and there's basically a couple of terms that I want to share with you. One is called GPP, and you will see this in gross primary productivity. Gross primary productivity. All right, and then the other one is called NPP, which is the net primary productivity. All right, so GPP is the gross. In effect, the gross production, you can see here, this is net production is analogous to growth rate. Net production is the growth rate of biomass. So in other words, when a plant is photosynthesizing, it's turning that energy into biomass. Net production can be expressed in a number of ways. Basically, what this is all about is this is the food that's made by photosynthesis. Easiest way to look at this. This is the food made by the plant via photosynthesis. All right, by photosynthesis. Now it says minus. Now why do we have to minus something? Okay, what do we have to minus? Well, we have to minus respiration, because the plant needs a certain amount. This is going to be the plant needs. I'll just call it the growth needs. The plant needs a certain amount of energy to grow, just like we need a certain amount of energy to grow. And it's going to get that energy from this gross production, in other words, from the food. Take this into account because it's going to greatly affect, it's going to give what we call the net production or net primary productivity. This text is calling it NP. Most texts will call it NPP and GPP. The idea is still the same, all right? In other words, the net production is what is available to the rest of the ecosystem. Available. All right, so food-wise. All right, for us, let's just say for us. And the rest of the ecosystem, all right? And ecosystem. All right, so this would be for these would be for the animals, what they go to the grazing animals. The respiration that the plant uses is going to be basically taken into account. That has to be taken into account before any of the net, if you will, for the grazers and stuff like that. And as I go through here, ecosystems are powered by solar energy with some exceptions like chemosynthesis, as we mentioned earlier. The conversion of solar energy to chemical energy, which is what this is accomplished by photosynthesis. The net growth of the plant is similar to the difference between photosynthesis and its rate of respiration. And you can see there's a couple of different ways to look at this. I could say the gross primary productivity, the gross productivity, if you will, gross production equals the net production plus respiration. Or if I wanted to look at, if I wanted to figure out what the net production was, and I knew what the gross production was and the respiration needs, I can calculate that by subtracting the respiration from the gross primary production. I'm just moving this around algebraically. And these are really some key differences. Now, what the analogy I used in class, and I'd like to reuse it now. I think I use it in all the classes, but basically a farmer feeding his family. All right, his family. Corn. All right. Well, if he wants to feed his family corn on the cob for dinner tonight, he's not. And he has several thousand acres in the back of his house. Well, of course, he's not going to go down to Jewel and buy some corn. That would be stupid. He's got the corn right in back for free. So he's going to go back out or send his kid back out, pick up 13 or 15 ears of corn for the family that night, and then move on with it. The key difference is the percentage. The amount a farmer would use to feed his family is small as a percentage. It might be 10 or 15 ears that are, and he's got thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of ears over a large expanse of land. You can imagine what this looks like. A plant, for a plant, it's much different. The percentages vary, but basically a plant, from my research, it's going to depend on the plant, but the plant can use, it's going to depend on the time of year also, but this is a pretty good number to remember. The plant can use 35 to 55% of its GP, all right, for its own needs. So if we looked at this, if we just took 50 to make a nice even number, this basically means that 50% of what the plant is making by photosynthesis, the biomass that it's assimilating and so forth, is used up by the plant for its own respiration needs so it can grow. So that's 50% of what it makes by photosynthesis is never available for the rest of the food chain. So that's really, really important to remember. Again, it's going to vary by plant, and it varies by the time of season and the sunlight and stuff like that. But the point I'm making is this amount of respiration here, a farmer here would just be a small amount of food for the energy for his family. This is a much larger percentage-wise, so that's the big difference for that. The rest of this I would encourage you to look at. This is pretty much exactly what we were just talking about here, biological production. The gross production is the total amount of fixed energy. Okay, that would be basically chemical energy, the glucose and whatnot. All right, chemical energy. And net production is the amount of acquired energy that is stored after some has been used for during respiration. Then I would encourage you to read this down here. 3 measures are used for biomass and biological production: the total biomass, the energy stored, and the carbon stored. All right, the biomass of a forest of trees